I still remember the smell. That's the first thing that comes back when I close my eyes and try to reconstruct that morning. Fresh bread drifting out of a bakery somewhere to my left, mixing with the sharp, warm scent of cumin and za'atar that a vendor was shaking over a wide metal tray. It was a little past 10 in the morning, and the market in Jerusalem was alive with people, families, children, old men sitting on plastic chairs, holding small glass cups of tea with both hands. A woman in a blue apron was arguing over the price of tomatoes with a man who kept shaking his head. A little girl, she couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, was pressed against a shop window, staring at a tray of honey pastries, her small breath fogging the glass. I saw all of it. I saw it, and I didn't see it, because my mind was somewhere else entirely. My mind was on the device strapped beneath my jacket, pressed against my ribs, armed and ready. My right hand was inside my coat. My fingers were resting on the trigger mechanism, and I had already counted it in my head. 3 seconds. That was all it would take. If you're watching this for the first time, and something inside you already feels the weight of what I'm about to say, please, before we go any further, subscribe to this channel and leave a like. It costs you nothing, but it means that what I'm about to tell you reaches someone else who might need it just as badly as I did. And now let me tell you what happened in those 3 seconds, and everything that led me to that market in the first place. My name is Karim. Karim Nassar. I was born in a small town northeast of Gaza, the third of 6 children. My father was a civil engineer who had stopped working by the time I was old enough to notice, not because he was lazy, but because there was simply less and less to build and more to mourn. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a thick black mustache that had started going gray at the edges when I was about 9 years old. He smelled like motor oil and cigarette smoke and, on Fridays after prayer, like the cedar soap my mother kept on the bathroom shelf. My mother was the center of everything. She was up before the sun every single morning, and I mean that literally. I would sometimes wake in the dark hours and hear her already moving in the kitchen. The soft clink of glass, the low murmur of her prayers. She made bread by hand, the kind that comes out of the oven with a slight char on the bottom and a hollow sound when you tap it. She knew every one of us by our footsteps. She could tell which of her children was walking down the hallway just by the rhythm of our steps on the tile floor. That's the kind of woman she was. I grew up with the sound of the call to prayer 5 times a day, with the smell of coriander and cardamom in the house, with the feeling, not just the idea, but the physical feeling of being part of a people who had been bleeding for generations. That wasn't an abstract political concept where I lived. It was the texture of daily life. It was in the conversations at dinner, in the photographs on the wall, in the way my father went quiet sometimes in the middle of a sentence and looked out the window at nothing I could see. I was Palestinian. I was Muslim. And very early on, I understood that those 2 things carried a weight that no child should have to carry, but that most children in my world carried anyway, because there was simply no alternative. When I was 12 years old, my uncle's house was demolished. I was there. I remember standing in the street with my cousins, watching a machine the size of a building push through concrete walls like they were paper. My aunt was screaming. Not a dramatic scream, a low, sustained animal sound that I had never heard a human being make before, and that I have never been able to forget. My cousin Rami, who was 15 at the time and had always been the funny one, the one who did impressions and made everyone laugh at weddings, sat down on a piece of rubble and didn't say a single word for the rest of the day. I watched his face, and something in it had changed in a way I couldn't name. I know now what it was. It was the moment a boy decides, somewhere very deep and very quiet inside himself, what kind of man he's going to become. I didn't become angry all at once. That's not how it works, and I think that's something people on the outside don't always understand. It's not like a switch. It's more like water getting into a wall. It happens slowly, silently, and by the time you see the damage, The structure has already been compromised for a long time. I was a decent student. I liked mathematics. I liked the way numbers behaved, the way they followed rules, the way if you did the right things in the right order, you always arrived at the same answer. The world around me did not work that way, and I think part of why math comforted me was precisely because it was the one space where things were fair, where the same inputs always produced the same outputs, where there was no history, no grief, no rubble. I want to tell you something about what it feels like to grow up inside a conflict that is already ancient before you are born. People sometimes ask me, especially people who grew up in countries that have known decades of relative peace, what it does to a child's sense of reality to live inside a situation where the violence is not occasional but structural, where it is not an interruption of normal life, but the water that normal life swims in. The honest answer is that you don't know it's doing anything to you because you have no reference point. You don't know that the way you've learned to read a street corner, instinctively calculating exits, instinctively noting who is watching whom, instinctively assessing the distance to the nearest wall, is not how children everywhere read street corners. You think that's just how the world is? You think everyone flinches at loud sounds? You think everyone sleeps lightly and wakes easily? It takes years, sometimes a lifetime, to understand that what you absorbed in childhood was not neutral information about the nature of reality. It was a wound that had shaped itself so perfectly to the contours of your life that it had become invisible. I was a good brother. That matters to me to say. Whatever else I became in those years, I was a good brother to my younger sisters, Hannah and Layla. Hannah was 4 years younger than me and wanted very seriously to be a doctor. She used to practice on the neighborhood cats, examining their paws with a gravity that made the whole family laugh. Layla was the youngest of all of us, and she had my mother's eyes and my father's stubbornness, and she used to steal my books and then deny it, with such absolute conviction that even I sometimes started to doubt my own memory. I used to help them both with their studies in the evenings, sitting at the kitchen table under the yellow light, while my mother moved behind us in the kitchen, and the smell of dinner filled the small apartment. Those evenings are the ones I return to most often when I think about who I was before. They are the proof for me that even in the years when I was being shaped into something I should never have become, there was still a person underneath who was capable of something other than destruction. That person was always there. He was just buried under a great deal of weight. I was about 15 when I first came into contact with the men who would eventually pull me into the current that led me to that Jerusalem market. It didn't happen through some dramatic recruitment scene. It happened the way most things happen in a place like where I grew up, through proximity, through existing in the same spaces as people who had a story to tell, and the time and patience to tell it to a teenager who was already halfway convinced. There was a man named Hassan who ran a small electronics repair shop near the mosque. He was maybe 35, 40, lean, dark-eyed, with a way of speaking that was always very calm and very certain. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. He had what I can only describe as a kind of gravity. People moved toward him without quite realizing they were doing it. Hassan started talking to me the way a mentor talks to a student. He asked about my studies. He asked about my father. He was interested, or he seemed interested, and at 15, I did not yet have the emotional sophistication to tell the difference between a man who is genuinely interested in you and a man who is very skilled at appearing that way. He lent me books. Not religious books at first. Political books, historical accounts, analyses of land and law and displacement. I read them all, and I felt reading them something I had not felt in a long time. That what I was feeling made sense. That the anger that had been building in me for years was not irrational, not childish, not something to be ashamed of. That it was, in fact, the only correct response to the situation I had been born into. It felt, for the first time in my life, like clarity. The religious framing came later, and it came gradually, layered over the political framework that had already been built in my mind. I don't want to use this testimony to go into the detailed theology of what I was taught, because it was a distorted theology, a manufactured one, designed specifically to produce a particular outcome in a particular kind of young man. What I will say is that by the time I was 17, I had been given a framework in which my life, my specific individual life, was not only expendable but sacred in its expendability. I had been taught that dying in a specific kind of act was the highest form of devotion, that it would transform everything, that it was, in the most literal sense, a door. My parents didn't know. That is something I have to say clearly, and carry the weight of saying clearly. My mother made bread and prayed before dawn and knew my footstep in the hallway, and she did not know what was happening to her son. My father sat at the dinner table and was quiet sometimes and looked out at something I couldn't see, and he did not know. I became very good at being two people simultaneously. At home, I was still the third child, the one who liked math, the one who helped his younger sisters with homework, the one who sat with his father on the small concrete step outside the front door on warm evenings and drank tea in silence. In the other world, I was being shaped into something else entirely. I want to tell you about the first time I understood what I was being prepared for. It was not a dramatic confrontation. It was a conversation in Hassan's shop, late on a winter afternoon, with the smell of solder in the air, and the sound of traffic outside, and the light already failing at 4 o'clock the way it does in winter. Hassan said to me very simply, very calmly, as if he were discussing something no more weighty than a technical problem. There are men who have given everything, men who chose the highest form of love. And he let the sentence sit there, and I let it sit there, and neither of us said the word that the sentence was pointing to because neither of us needed to. I was 16, and I felt in that moment something I am deeply ashamed to admit I felt. I felt chosen. I felt like someone had finally seen that I was capable of more than mathematics homework and kitchen table tutoring. I felt significant. That feeling, that hunger for significance, for meaning, for a role in a story that was larger than ordinary life, was the real mechanism of my radicalization. The ideology was the delivery system. The hunger was the wound that it exploited. I want to tell you something about the training because I think it's important and because I've never said it publicly before. It was not what you see in the movies. It was not dramatic. It was methodical. It was psychological. It was months of very slow, very deliberate work designed to dismantle the instincts that every human being is born with and replace them with a set of instructions. The instinct that says, that child holding her mother's hand is a child. The instinct that says, that old man drinking tea is a human being who has a family and a history and a name. Those instincts were what the training was specifically designed to eliminate. And it worked. I know it worked because by the time I was standing in that market, I had stopped seeing people. I was seeing obstacles and targets and a mission. I was 19 years old. The night before, I had slept for maybe 2 hours. I lay on a thin mattress in a concrete room and stared at the ceiling and went through the prayers I had been taught. I said goodbye in my mind to my mother and my father and my sisters, one by one, the way you say goodbye to people when you believe you are leaving permanently and that the leaving is righteous. I was calm. That is the terrifying thing I need to tell you. I was calm. Not the calm of peace, the calm of a machine that has been fully configured and is now simply waiting to execute its function. I got up before sunrise. I washed, I dressed, I prayed, and I walked toward Jerusalem. By the time I entered the market, everything in my body was focused. My breathing was controlled. My pace was measured. I had rehearsed the route 17 times in the weeks before. I knew where the cameras were. I knew where the crowd would be densest at that hour. I had been told exactly where to stand and exactly how long to wait before completing the mission. My hand was inside my coat. My fingers were on the trigger. I was counting down. 3 seconds, 2, and then I heard it. I need to be careful here about how I describe this because I know how it sounds, and I am not a man who exaggerates or who performs emotion for effect. I was raised to be precise. I am telling you exactly what happened to the best of my ability to tell it. I heard a voice, not from a person standing near me, not from a speaker, not from inside my own thoughts the way your own internal voice sounds. It was distinct from all of those things. It was clear. It was calm. And it spoke my name, not Kareem, which was the name the cell used for me, my full name, the name my mother gave me, the name that only people who had known me since before everything started would have used. And then it asked me a question, one sentence, in Arabic, and the question was, Kareem, who told you that I want this? I froze. I don't have a better word for it. My body stopped functioning as a machine and became a body again, and a body that had just been asked a question it had no answer for. The crowd kept moving around me. The woman in the blue apron was still arguing about her tomatoes. The little girl was still breathing on the glass of the pastry shop window. The old men were still holding their tea. Nobody had heard anything. Nobody was looking at me. The world was continuing exactly as it had been continuing 1 second before, and I was standing completely still in the middle of it, my hand inside my coat, my fingers on the trigger, and a question echoing in my chest that I could not answer and could not dismiss. Who told you that I want this? I stood there for what felt like a very long time. It was probably less than a minute, but time had become strange and thick. My training screamed at me to continue. The voice I had just heard was not screaming, it was waiting, patient and present in a way that the loudest part of my training was not. And the question kept sitting there, in my chest, in the silence, underneath all the noise of the market. Who told you that I want this? And for the first time in 2 years, for the first time since Hassan and his calm certainty and his borrowed books, I did not have an answer that I fully believed. I took my hand out of my coat. I do not know exactly how I decided to do that. I cannot give you a rational sequence of steps that led from one moment to the next. What I can tell you is that something cracked open in me in that market, standing between the bread smell and the cumin and the sound of a little girl laughing at something in a shop window, and that what came through the crack was not a political argument or a theological debate. It was something older and simpler and more fundamental than either of those things, something that felt, in the strangest and most disorienting way, like recognition. I walked out of the market. I did not run. I walked. I found a side street and I sat down on a stone step, and I put my head in my hands and I sat there for a long time while the morning happened around me. A cat came and sat near my feet. There were pigeons on a wire above me. Someone somewhere was frying something, and the smell of it drifted over the alley in a warm wave. I was shaking, but not from fear exactly. From something more like the aftermath of a fever breaking, like a body returning to a temperature it's supposed to be at. I spent 2 days in a kind of suspended state. I stayed in a small rented room that the cell had arranged for the night before the mission, and I simply stayed there. I did not contact anyone. I ate almost nothing. I slept in long, strange intervals and woke from dreams I couldn't remember, but that left me with the feeling of having been spoken to. The question kept returning, not as something frightening, as something genuinely open. Who told you that I want this? And underneath it, another question that I hadn't even consciously formed yet, but that was already present. What if the God I thought I was serving was not who I had been told he was? What if the entire framework, the theology, the mission, the sacred expendability, had been built not from truth, but from someone else's agenda? What does a person do with that? I spent 2 days in a kind of suspended state. I stayed in a small rented room that the cell had arranged for the night before the mission, and I simply stayed there. I did not contact anyone. I ate almost nothing. There was a half-eaten flatbread on the small table when I arrived, dry at the edges, and I tore pieces of it mechanically without tasting it and drank water from the tap. The room smelled of damp plaster and something faintly sweet that I couldn't identify, and the window looked out onto a narrow alley where a ginger cat slept on a ledge in the afternoon sun, completely unbothered by the world. I watched that cat for a long time on the first day. It moved from one patch of sunlight to another as the light shifted, with absolute confidence and no apparent concern for anything beyond the warmth of the next available spot. There was something in that, in its complete absorption in the immediate physical fact of warmth and rest, that was both unbearable and clarifying to me in my state. I slept in long, strange intervals and woke from dreams I couldn't remember, but that left me with the feeling of having been spoken to. The question kept returning, not as something frightening, as something genuinely open. Who told you that I want this? And underneath it, another question that I hadn't even consciously formed yet, but that was already present. What if the God I thought I was serving was not who I'd been told he was? What if the entire framework, the theology, the mission, the sacred expendability, had been built not from truth, but from someone else's agenda? What does a person do with that? I want to stop here for a second because I genuinely want to know where you're watching this from. If you're somewhere in the Middle East, if you're in Europe, if you're in the United States or Brazil or Nigeria or somewhere in Asia, leave it in the comments. Tell me where you are. Because one of the things I discovered on the other side of this story is that loneliness, the particular loneliness of being in the middle of a crisis that no one around you can see, is universal. It speaks every language. And knowing that someone else, somewhere else, is sitting with their own version of an unanswerable question makes the question a little less crushing. So, tell me where you are. I want to know. On the third day, I walked into a church. I did not plan it. I had walked past it on the first day, when I was still barely functioning, and I had registered it the way you register an object in the periphery, not with attention, just with awareness. It was a small church, not one of the famous ones, not a tourist destination. A simple building with a wooden door painted dark blue and a small cross above it and the sound, I remember the sound, of someone playing a piano inside. Not a hymn I recognized, just a melody, slow and searching, the kind of music that sounds like it's asking a question rather than stating an answer. And on the third day, for no reason I could fully explain, I stopped in front of that door. And then I opened it. And then I went in. The interior was cool and dim and smelled like candle wax and old wood. There were rows of simple wooden pews and light coming through two narrow windows on the side wall in long, dusty columns. A man was sitting at a small, upright piano near the front, playing that melody. And he didn't stop when I came in. He just kept playing, as if my arriving was not unusual, as if people came in from the street all the time. And that was simply what the door was for. I sat down in a pew near the back. The wood was smooth and worn under my hands, worn down by years of other hands resting in the same place. And I sat there and the music played and I felt, for the first time in days, like I could breathe. A man came and sat down next to me eventually, an older man with white hair and a kind face, wearing a simple gray sweater that had a small moth hole near the left elbow. He didn't say anything for a while. He just sat. And this is something I didn't understand at the time, but have thought about often since. The simple act of someone sitting near you without requiring anything of you, without needing you to explain yourself or perform a particular emotion or justify your presence, is one of the rarest forms of kindness in the world. Most people, when they encounter someone in distress, feel an urgency to fix, to speak, to offer something. Father Elias, which is who I would later learn this man was, sat with me in the church that afternoon and simply existed nearby, like a warm weight in the room. Then he said quietly in Arabic, "You look like someone who has been carrying something very heavy." I didn't answer. He didn't push. He just sat there with me for a few minutes, and then he said, "There's no pressure here, but if you want to talk, I'm here. My name is Father Elias." And he got up quietly and went to sit near the front of the church, leaving me alone with the piano and the candle smell and the light coming through those narrow windows. I came back the next day, and the day after that. I didn't know why exactly. I only knew that in that building, in the presence of that particular quietness, the question didn't feel as terrifying as it did everywhere else. Father Elias was there most days. We began to talk, slowly, carefully, the way you talk to someone when you're not entirely sure what language you're speaking. I didn't tell him who I was or what I had almost done. Not at first. I asked him questions about Jesus, about who he was, about why Christians believed what they believed. And Father Elias answered me with a patience and a gentleness that I was completely unequipped to receive. He never seemed frustrated by my challenges, and I did challenge him, sometimes aggressively, bringing arguments I'd been given over years of a very particular kind of education. He received every argument not with defensiveness, but with what I can only describe as genuine curiosity, as if my challenges were interesting to him rather than threatening. That was not the kind of engagement I'd been trained to expect from someone whose position was being questioned. It disoriented me. I kept waiting for the angle, for the manipulation, for the moment when the conversation would reveal itself as something other than what it appeared to be. It never came. What I learned about Jesus in those conversations was nothing like what I had been taught he was. I had been given, over the course of my radicalization, a very specific and very distorted picture of Jesus. A minor prophet, a historical footnote, a figure who had been co-opted and corrupted by Western imperialism and used as a tool of oppression. Father Elias did not argue with that framing. He simply told me who Jesus actually was, in his own words, from the Gospels. He read to me from the Gospel of John. He read me the passage where Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." And those words landed in me differently than any words had landed in me in a very long time. Not because they were comfortable, because they were the opposite of comfortable, because they were a claim so total, so absolute, so without qualification, that the only honest responses were either complete rejection or complete surrender. There was no comfortable middle ground, no room for the kind of selective belief I had been trained to practice. I want to tell you something about the moment when I finally believed. It didn't happen in the church, although the church was where the foundation was laid. It happened one evening when I was alone in my room, sitting on the edge of the bed, reading a copy of the New Testament that Father Elias had given me. I had been reading for hours. My eyes were tired. The light was fading outside the window, that particular shade of gold and purple that Jerusalem has in the evening, a color I've never seen in exactly the same way anywhere else in the world. And I was reading the account of the crucifixion, reading slowly, word by word, the way I'd been trained to read technical documents, with precision, without assumption. And I arrived at the moment when Jesus, in agony, looks out at the people who are killing him and says, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." I stopped reading. I sat very still, because I suddenly understood, in a way that bypassed every intellectual framework I'd ever built, exactly what those words meant. I had been one of those people. I had stood in a market with my hand on a trigger, prepared to end lives, and I had not known what I was doing. Not really, I had thought I knew. I had been told I knew. But the truth was that I had been as deceived as any of the people in that account, as blind, as captive to a story that someone else had written for me. And this man, this Jesus, this carpenter's son, who walked through Galilee and touched lepers and ate with outcasts and wept at his friend's grave and said that the meek would inherit the earth, this man, dying, had prayed for me, had prayed for everyone like me, not after the fact, not with conditions, not as a transaction, as an instinct, as the expression of something so deeply embedded in who he was that it came out even in the worst moment of his life. I put the book down on the bed. I got on my knees on the floor. The floor was cold stone and it was hard on my knees and I didn't care at all. And I prayed, not the prayers I had been taught, not a performance. I just talked in the plainest language I had to the God I had just encountered in those words. I said, I don't know how to undo what I almost did. I don't know how to become someone different than who I've been becoming for the last 4 years. But I believe you are who you say you are. And if you want me, you're going to have to show me what to do with the rest of my life, because I have absolutely no idea. The room was very quiet after that. Outside, someone was calling the evening prayer from a minaret somewhere nearby. The sound drifted through the window and over me, and I felt something strange. Not hostility toward it, but a kind of tenderness. As if I could hear in it the genuine longing of people reaching toward a God they love, even if the path I was now walking was different from the path that voice was calling toward. I understood in that moment that my leaving one faith tradition was not a rejection of the people who still walked in it. It was the most honest thing I could do with what I had been given. Telling Father Elias was one of the hardest things I have ever done. Not because I feared his reaction. I knew him well enough by then to trust that his response would be measured and kind. It was hard because saying it out loud meant it was real. It meant I was a person who had almost detonated a bomb in a crowded market full of families and children and old men drinking tea. And I had to say that with my mouth to another human being and let the reality of it exist in the air between us. Father Elias listened without interrupting. His face did not change in the way I had feared it might. When I finished, he sat quietly for a moment, and then he said, Karim, the grace of God is not a small thing. It does not apply only to small sins. It applies to exactly what you've just told me. And then he put his hand on my shoulder, and I realized I was crying, which was something I had not allowed myself to do since I was approximately 12 years old. There were immediate practical consequences to my decision that I will not detail fully here, for reasons of safety that still apply many years later. What I will tell you is that leaving was not a clean or simple process. There were people who had known me in the cell who were not pleased. There were threats. There was a period of time when I was not safe in the way that most people understand the word safe, when moving from one place to another required planning and care. And the help of people, I am still grateful to this day for their courage. Father Elias was one of those people. There were others, in the small Christian community I was beginning to belong to, who took risks on my behalf that I did not deserve, and that I have tried to honor every day since. My family was the hardest part. Not because they were dangerous. My parents were not part of any of what I'd been involved in and had no idea the depths of it. The hardest part was the shame. Telling my mother that I'd converted to Christianity was a conversation I rehearsed in my mind for months before I had the courage to have it. When I finally did over the phone, with my voice steady in the way you hold your voice steady, when you are terrified of what you're saying, she was silent for a very long time. And then she said, in that voice she had, that voice that knew my footstep in the hallway, "Are you safe?" Not, "How could you?" Not, "You have dishonored us." Just, "Are you safe?" And I understood in that question everything about who my mother was and how she had loved us, all 6 of us, through everything. I told her yes. I was not entirely sure it was true, but I said it and I meant it as a promise more than a fact. My father did not speak to me for almost 2 years. That silence was its own kind of weight, a presence in my daily life, even when I was hundreds of kilometers away from him, a cold space in my chest that I carried everywhere. I prayed for him. I prayed for my mother. I prayed for my brothers and sisters. And I tried to understand, without bitterness, that their silence and their grief and their anger were not cruelty. They were love, expressing itself the only way it knew how, in a context where what I had done was not just a religious choice, but a seismic cultural and familial event. The community that surrounded me in those first years was not perfect. No community is. There were people who were suspicious of me for reasons that were completely understandable. A young Palestinian man appearing suddenly at a small church in Jerusalem, with a background he was being deliberately vague about, asking very direct questions about Jesus. It was not an obvious picture of safety. I respect the people who were cautious. I respect even more the people who, despite their caution, chose to extend themselves anyway. There was a woman named Miriam who used to bring food to the church for anyone who needed it on Sunday afternoons, not out of an organized program, just out of the reflex of a person who had grown up believing that hospitality was a form of prayer. The first Sunday I stayed after the service, she put a plate of rice and braised lamb in front of me without asking whether I wanted it, and then sat down across from me and talked to me about her grandchildren for 20 minutes, with a completely natural ease that moved me more than any sermon I had yet heard. She had decided, by some internal calculation I will never fully understand, that I was worth the gamble. That decision changed something in me. The community that surrounded me in those first years was not perfect. No community is. But it was real, and it was present. And it taught me something I'd never learned in any of my previous communities, that faith is not primarily a set of obligations or a source of power or a framework for justifying action. Faith, real faith, the kind that costs something, is a relationship. It is a conversation that happens in both directions. It is the experience of being known and inexplicably still being wanted. I encountered that in the reading of the Gospels. I encountered it in the prayers of people who had no reason to pray for me but did anyway. I encountered it in small, concrete acts of kindness. The meals people made when I was struggling, the phone calls at unexpected moments, the way Father Elias would sometimes simply sit with me without speaking, as if he understood that the most useful thing he could offer was his presence rather than his words. Jesus, I came to understand, was not an idea, was not a historical figure in the way that phrase implies distance and completion, was not a symbol or cultural identifier or justification for any human agenda. Jesus is a person, someone who could be known, someone whose voice I had heard in a crowded Jerusalem market when I was 19 years old, with my hand on a trigger, who had asked me a question so simple and so devastating that it had stopped me cold in a way that nothing and no one else ever could have. Someone who had, according to the account I had read, kneeling on a cold stone floor, prayed for me before I existed. That was not the God I had been handed. That was a God I could not have invented. And the God you cannot invent is the only kind worth taking seriously. My work now, and I say work because it is that. It requires effort and commitment and the willingness to be uncomfortable, is peace. Not peace as a political slogan or a diplomatic ambition, although I care deeply about both. Peace as a practice, as a daily choice to see the human being in front of me, rather than the category I might instinctively assign them to. I have spoken in communities across the Middle East and in Europe and in parts of Africa. I have sat across from people who were trained as I was trained and who are still inside the framework I escaped. I have also sat across from people on the other side of the conflict who carry their own forms of dehumanization, their own trained blindness to the humanity of those they oppose. And what I have found in every one of those conversations is that the capacity for a different kind of seeing, for the radical, irrational, theologically grounded insistence on the full humanity of every person in the room, is always present. It is never entirely extinguished. It can be suppressed and buried and covered over with layers of ideology and grief and righteous anger, but it is there. I know it is there because I know what it felt like when it came back to life in me, standing between a bread smell and the sound of a little girl laughing at a shop window in the 3 seconds before I would have lost it forever. I still think about that little girl, the one who was pressed against the pastry shop window. I don't know her name. I never will. But she has been present in my prayers for every single year since that morning. She is one of the faces I carry when I speak in front of audiences that have traveled to hear a story they couldn't quite believe when they read the headline. She is what I mean when I say that grace is not small. Grace is the distance between what happened and what could have happened. Grace is a specific little girl breathing on a shop window on a Tuesday morning in Jerusalem, unaware that anything had almost changed for her, going home that afternoon to her family with honey pastry on her fingers, her life fully intact. Grace is a voice that knows your name and chooses to ask a question instead of issuing a verdict. I began this story in the middle of a market with my hand inside my coat. I want to end it in a different kind of fullness. Not the fullness of resolution, because that would be dishonest, but the fullness of a life that is genuinely being lived rather than being pointed at a target. There are still hard days. There are still mornings when the weight of what I almost did lands on me before I'm fully awake, and I have to work through it again, carefully, in the presence of the God who asked me a question in a crowded place and waited patiently while I found my way to an answer. There are still conversations with my Father that contain silences that never fully close. There is still the ongoing work of becoming a person who lives consistently with what he believes, which is harder in the daily texture of real life than it sounds in a testimony like this one. But Jesus is not a conclusion I arrived at and filed away. He is a presence I walk with, a voice I have continued to hear, not always as dramatically as the first time, but consistently and unmistakably in the words I read and in the community around me, and in the particular quality of silence that follows genuine prayer. He said, "He is the way," and I have found that to be true in the most literal sense. Not metaphorically, not philosophically, but practically. Step by step, day by day, in a direction that is consistently, unmistakably different from the direction I was walking when I entered that market. The device I was carrying that morning was disassembled later, in circumstances I will not describe, by people who took significant personal risk to ensure that it would never be used. I think about that act of practical, unglamorous courage often, about the hands that did that work, about the ordinary heroism of people who simply decided to make something dangerous into something inert. That is, I have come to believe, what every genuine act of faith looks like up close. Not grand gestures, not dramatic transformations, just the patient, careful daily work of disassembling what was built to destroy and leaving in its place nothing more or less than the quiet fact of a life that chose differently. If you've made it to the end of this, if you've sat with this story all the way through, I want you to know that it was not shared lightly. Every word of this costs something to say. But I believe with everything in me that testimonies like this one exist not as entertainment and not as spectacle, but as signals, as evidence that no one is too far gone, that the same voice that stopped me in a Jerusalem market can reach into whatever space you are in right now, wherever that is and however it feels, and ask you the question that only you need to hear. Subscribe to this channel if you want to keep receiving stories like this one. Stories from people who have been in the dark and found their way towards something real. We are building something here. Not an audience, but a community of people who believe that transformation is possible and that the truth is worth telling even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Share this video with one person who needs to hear it. You probably already know who that person is. And if something in this story is speaking to something in you right now, don't wait. The voice that knows your name is not impatient, but some moments are closer to the edge than others. And 3 seconds, as I know better than almost anyone alive, is a very short time.